morning, all. Somebody's audio has a feedback or something. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, everyone.
Hi, everybody.
We should say good evening as well, Raffle.
Yes, indeed.
So I put up the antitrust slide for everybody's reading pleasure. No one did anything wrong. Just put it up there as part of policy. So for today's agenda, last week we discussed release management, and we talked about getting David involved for LFN just to speak to the team around release management and some best practices. So we could start off with David when everyone's ready.
Right. Thanks, Lewis. Should I start?
Yeah, let's see. It's 4 minutes after. Folks, you want to start with David, or you want to give it another few minutes?
No, I think it's good to start now. I was a little late because I had some issues with Zoom that I finally conquered. But I think
No worries.
I think we have quorum from all the companies, so yeah,
Looks like it.
let's do it.
David, let me make sure you can make co-hosts. You should be able to share either way,
Yeah.
but go for it. And thank you.
Okay. Let's see. See, I'm clicking the share button, but it's not putting it up on the screen for some reason. There we go. Okay, can everyone see that?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, first of all, thanks for inviting me today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some general principles about how we do, or at least my experience doing release management within LFN. And then I'm going to show you an example of something that I've been working on to see how it plays out in real life. Just to give you a little background, I've been with the Linux Foundation for almost 5 years now. I've served as the release manager for both OPNFV and also ONAP, and I also, for about a year or so, I was the technical program manager for OPNFV. And so I've had quite a bit of experience with this, at least within the LFN umbrella. And so what I'm going to present to you today is based on that experience. And if you talk to other people have other opinions and probably disagree with some of the things I talk about here. But you can ask 10 people how to do release management and get 10 different valid answers. So so this is I guess my point is that this isn't necessarily definitive. This is based on what I've seen, what works. Okay, and then the other thing to keep in mind here is that every project is a little different. And so I'm going to be talking about these things at a fairly high level. And you might react to some of these things that I suggest by saying, well, gee, that wouldn't work for our project. And that very well may be true, or it might work, but it needs to be adjusted a certain way. So, keep that in mind. These aren't hard and fast rules. These are just some general guidelines.
Hi, David. This is Susan Bowen from HPE. Just one quick question for you.
Sure.
I see that you're recording. Are these slides that you could also make available on the wiki?
Yeah, I absolutely. I think do I have editing privileges on this wiki, Lewis? I think I probably do if it's in the LFN space. So I
think you probably do, but we'll get it to you.
Yeah. If you can give me the agenda page, then I can link these slides to that page.
Perfect. Thank you.
Sure, no problem. All right. So the first thing to think about when you talk about release management is cadence. In other words, how often do we want to release? And from what I've seen, a pretty common choice is to do about 2 releases a year. Sometimes projects will try to do like 4 releases a year, or maybe they'll do 2 major releases and then some maintenance releases. So there's some variation there, but 2 releases a year is pretty common. The other thing that I've seen, especially with new groups, is that everyone's very excited and really wants to drive the thing hard and says, what, 2 releases a year? We want to do 1 release every month or something like that. And just keep in mind that these projects are a marathon, not a sprint. And so in order to keep this up over the long haul, you have to keep in mind that open source projects are typically thinly staffed and often by people that are working in there as a part-time project, and they have other jobs that they're doing. So so be careful about being too aggressive in terms of deciding on cadence. Also, I mentioned maintenance releases, and you have to be careful about those as well, because again, frequently these projects are thinly staffed, and so you risk distracting your developers, with a maintenance release on top, which is typically happening at the same time as a new major release. And the other thing too is that typically you need a separate CI workflow to support that maintenance release so that you can verify it before you release it. So be if certainly you got critical bugs, security issues, or whatever, certainly maintenance releases need to be done, but think carefully about your resources and what you're trying to get done before you go down that road. And I can give you an example. I just recently working with the ONAP team, and we kicked off our what we call a Guilin release. Guilin is a Chinese city. ONAP releases are named after cities, and at the time that we kicked off the release, a handful of ambitious members said, "Oh, we also want to do maintenance releases of 2 previous releases." And so as a good release manager, I waved my arms and warned them about, that they may, that they could get distracted on working on the Guilin release, which had a compressed schedule anyway, by working on these maintenance releases. And they assured me that that wouldn't be a problem. Well, of course, as anticipated, the maintenance releases, they got bogged down in the maintenance releases, and that caused several delays in Guilin and pushed out the schedule. And eventually they conceded that that the maintenance releases had in fact impacted the main release. So my message there is just, when you're thinking about releases, think long and hard before you commit yourself to a maintenance release, because they often end up being more difficult than you plan.
Definition of a CI workflow?
Oh, so CI is continuous integration. And so typically your developers are committing code into, I'm not sure what tool chain you guys use, but typically, it's going to be like Garrett and Jenkins or GitLab or whatever. And so then there are triggers, scans, and code gets built and tests get run and so on. So if you're working on a major release, then of course you have a CI workflow for that. Your maintenance release is going to be on a separate branch. And so you have to have the capacity, the continuous integration capacity, to support verification of that other branch as you make changes to it. At times that, that can be fairly costly. So in addition to the impact on your developers, you also have CI resources that are involved as well.
Perfect, thank you.
Welcome. Okay, so once you've decided on a cadence, say every 6 months, then the next step is to break that cadence into, or that time period into phases. And as I mentioned before, every project is a little different, but typically those phases will include some kind of a requirements collection and prioritization, as well as individual project release planning. Are you guys set up with separate sub-projects? Do you have a collection of sub-projects under ODIM?
Not
or
yet.
Is it monolithic?
Can you hear me? Or?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So no, we have no sub-projects yet. Well, it depends on how you look at it. So we have like the same, if you look at it from Git, we have the same project and then different branches we work off. Like there's one branch going off working on a plugin right now, and then there's another branch doing something else. So, but we don't have like, how do you define a sub-project? Like a separate repository?
Yeah, typically they're associated with different repositories. So they could be anything from different components that come together, that integrate to make a whole. They could be different functionalities, like you could have a test sub-project or an integration sub-project, or a lot of projects have a documentation sub-project. That focuses on the documentation build chain and the documentation structure and so on.
Yeah, I think.
So I guess we will have the different repositories, like for simulator or maybe for Composer.
Thanks, Rafa.
And typically that's described in your charter. So your charter will talk about having sub projects underneath the main project, and And typically those have their own team, and you have a identified set of committers, and you have a what we call a project technical lead, or a PTL, who provides leadership for the project. And usually that's described in the charter. Anyway, that's something to think about as you develop sub-projects, likely based around different repositories, different teams working on different repositories. You want to have those projects create a release plan just for their individual sub-project. And we'll talk about that in a little more detail in a moment. So that's that planning phase around requirements and project release planning. That's typically the first phase. Then you have your development phase. Then you typically have like an API and feature freeze. Then you do individual component test and debug. And then finally, you go through an integration phase and maybe produce one or more release candidates before you finally complete your release. The integration test phase, that kind of presumes that the project has separate components that are being worked on that need to be integrated and work together at the end. Now, some projects, their sub-projects are more siloed, so they don't have that integration phase. Or you might have a combination of both. You might have some projects that are work together and become integrated at the end of the release, whereas other projects, stand alone. So you'll have to figure that out. But typically, you have at least some kind of integration that has to occur, toward the end of the release. The other important thing when you're deciding on these phases for your project, you also need to think about who's doing the work, because you need someone to take a responsibility for this. So for example, for requirements collection, for a large project, that's often too much for the TSC to take on. And so, for example, in the ONAP project, the ONAP has a TSC subcommittee that specifically all they do is deal with requirements. And so people propose requirements. They vet those requirements to make sure that they are aligned with the goals of and objectives of ONAP. And the other thing that they go through is looking at what the work is that's involved and so on. And so that's a fair amount of effort. And so rather than trying to do that all within the technical steering committee, there is a requirements subcommittee that works on that. Similarly, for integration, if you have a significant integration effort, what you're going to find is that you have a bunch of projects that need to integrate together, but they need some kind of a leadership, some kind of a glue that pulls them all together, because they are normally kind of working separately. And they've gone through their development process, tests, and so on. And it's like they're, well, we're ready to integrate. Well, how do we integrate? Well, a lot of times having an integration team, like a project specifically dedicated to integration, that worries about all of the infrastructure that's necessary and so on, and coordinates getting the release artifacts or the release candidate artifacts from the different projects and so on, and pulling those all together and conducting integration tests. that's a significant effort. And so it helps to have a specific integration team that works on that.
David,
and then, yeah.
Just an observation. What we have here, I think, is infinitely more simple and less, less complex, I would say, than what ONAP is. We didn't start with 7 million lines of code as a seed. This is a much smaller effort, and as Jonas pointed out, using a branching strategy, instead of multiple sub projects and whatnot, is probably what we're going to do for a while. I mean, they may be one-offs, but for the most part, that's kind of what we're doing. So a lot of the stuff you're talking about certainly would apply to projects like ONAP, where you have, independent components that need to be cobbled together somehow. But here it's a much more cohesive sort of environment. So, so a lot of these things that you're talking about are really meant for large projects, right? It's not how you would do it for a simpler one.
I disagree with that.
No, okay.
So as I said earlier, so these techniques will vary based on the project, but the principles still hold. So as I say here in this bullet, as you're determining these phases, also think about who will be doing the work. And so you may not need an integration team, but you will probably still need to do some level of integration. So you need to put some consideration into how that will be done. Likewise with requirements, maybe you're only going to have a handful of requirements, and maybe those can be handled by the TSC, but you still need to make that assessment. Does the TSC, that meets once a week for an hour or whatever, have the capacity to evaluate project requirements, determine how they affect individual components, prioritize them, etc. That can take a fair amount of time. So maybe that's something that the TSC can take on, but it doesn't take a lot of requirements work to get to a point where all the TSC is doing is working on requirements, and they don't have time to do anything else. So regardless of how you do it, whether you have dedicated teams or whatever, my point here is that you still need to think about, you still need to evaluate how much work needs to be done and who specifically will be doing that. So that's my major point there. Okay, so getting a little more into requirements gathering. So having this requirements phase is important because it's what keeps you on track at a high level as a project. So typically when you form a project, you create a it's not a vision statement. It's what is it? Lewis, help me out here. What do we call that? I keep wanting to say vision statement, but it's not vision statement. Anyway, it's a summary of what the goals and objectives of the project are. And so in order to keep you aligned on that, you want to consider what you're doing in the release at a high level. Otherwise, you end up with just kind of a lot of sort of siloed efforts at a low level that are doing work on individual components and so on without any kind of a grand strategy. So this is, when we talk about technical steering committee, the steering aspect of that comes through in this requirements process. So when you typically you collect the requirements, and the way that I like to do it is to have the requirements documented in JIRA. So for example, in ONAP, we have a requirements project in JIRA, And so proposed requirements get put into that project. And that's helpful because we can track, their progress and, changes, or if they get deferred, et cetera, until they're completed.
So how does this, first up, so how does this tie into, Scrum model, where everything is user stories and you really sort them by epics and other things? Secondly, we don't have Jira. So what we're doing now is we basically use Git issues as well as a proposal page inside TSC, where we have larger type of, you can call them requirements or requests or proposals of some feature that we should support, and those are the ones we kind of process. But the smaller ones, like, oh, change this parameter in this configuration file, that's a developer type of agreement, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, collecting requirements and driving that separately seems pretty waterfallish to me. How do you? Yeah,
and that's that's a frequent criticism of this process that I'm describing. And my experience is that agile efforts work well at the sub-project level, but it's very difficult. And in my experience, I've never seen it actually happen at a project of any size, to do it at the project level. And so what I tell people is that if you have and the other thing that you run into is that with a large project where you have maybe hundreds of developers, not everyone is going to want to work in Agile. And so you end up having some projects that that want to do Agile, other projects that don't. And so what I tell people is allow your individual sub-projects to work in an Agile manner if that's what they want to do. And then what I'm describing here is kind of an umbrella process that encompasses that work underneath. And so I don't see a discrepancy between having this process at a high level while individual sub-projects, working on individual repositories, can work in an Agile fashion.
I agree with that. And I think we all ran into that in different companies, like Agile doesn't scale to huge projects. So no worries. But so the requirement, when you call them requirements, it just takes your mind to, okay, we have gone out to some users and we gathered. But I think what TSC is on top of is more like the long-term architectural goals, like, and requirements might come into that, as this is what we should be able to do.
Mm-hmm.
So just to put it in practical terms, right? So the requirements subcommittee that David is talking about in ONAP is a subset of the TSC. There are other committees that focus on specific use cases, which is appropriate because you've got all sorts of big, huge moving parts in ONAP.
Mm-hmm.
But
they also have an architectural
right. So
well.
there's also an architectural review committee that takes those requirements and then really tries to assess their impact on what's going on in terms of the architectural roadmap and the development roadmap and whatnot, right? So it's not that these efforts are all separate. They're all part of the TSC umbrella, and they're led by people who are members of the TSC typically. And so it's not that they're very different. And in our case, Jonas, if we had some operators that could provide those requirements, I think that would actually be good.
Yeah, and I think we should keep this as a model that where we want to go as we grow. if we were to put all these committees in place under TSC, we would have one guy in every committee, or we would have everybody in every committee.
I agree with you. I think we
Yeah,
need the right
I mean, you know, it could very well, you know, the TSC is a good place to start out with all of these things, okay? And you know, as you grow, you'll notice at some point it's like, you know, hey, you know, we're spending 90% of our time working through these requirements, and we have no time to talk about, you know, X, Y, and Z. And at that point, that's kind of your signal to say, oh, you know, we've grown, and we need to extend ourselves here and offload this to you know, a subcommittee. But you know, it very well could be that all, you know, initially that all of this can be accomplished within the scope of the TSC.
Yeah, that's helpful.
And also, when I'm talking about requirements here, I want to be careful to distinguish between, you know, high level, you know, ODIM requirements versus individual, you know, requirements at a like an individual repo level. And sometimes that's a little different to describe, but the way I try to make the point to people is, imagine requirements that span, you know, multiple sub-projects or repositories. In other words, requirements that don't just apply to a single component or a single repository. So an example might be like migrating from Java 8 to Java 11, you know, things like that. Things that are associated with like the overall security of the project, or that go directly to the long-term, you know, strategic objectives of the project. So these are requirements that are at a high level that span multiple sub-projects and repositories. So in terms of the release, as I said, this is a key way that you know, this is where you get the steering and technical steering committee, is by establishing these requirements. But it takes a certain amount of effort and analysis. So for example, one thing that you need to do is you need to look at, okay, you know, does this requirement affect all sub-projects and repositories, or, you know, 2 or 3 of them, or what? And then you'll have teams that are associated with those individual sub-projects or repositories, and you can't just assume that they're going to do the work, because remember, you know, they typically have their own goals that they're working on for their individual sub-projects. So there needs to be a dialogue between the people that are looking at the requirements and the people that need to actually do the actual development work to implement the requirements, to make sure that everyone's on the same page and that they're willing to do the work. And you know, going back to ONAP again, that's a thing that frequently sinks some requirement proposals, because someone will say, well, we should do such and such, and you know, several of the projects that are involved, you know, say, no, you know, I'm overwhelmed here, I've got too much to do already, we can't take that on. And so the requirement ends up being deferred, or you know, reduced in scope or whatever, so that it can accommodate the development capacity that you have. So getting alignment between your aspirations in terms of your requirements and the where the rubber meets the road with execution is really critical. Otherwise, your requirements list is, you know, just a fantasy.
I think that's where we have a problem today. Our approach today is to look at proposals and we approve them, and I don't think we do it with, oh, they need to go into this release in mind. So that might be an issue we need to look at.
Yeah, yeah. Assigning, having a function where you have a formal way of taking in requirement proposals and analyzing them, and assigning them to a release, which takes into account your capacity to get work done and so on. I think that's really important, and it gives you a lot of credibility, because if people submit requirements to you and you approve them, and 2 years later they still haven't been implemented, people start to lose faith in the project. So you want to have that capacity to be able to analyze the requirement and say yes or no, and say, we will get this done in fall of 2021, or whatever.
Jonas, this is what we talked about kind of during the last meeting, right? That we kind of need to start slotting features or requirements that result in features into a particular release, and that would be part of our release train if that's the model we want to adopt. Right.
Yeah. I think this is a lot of good input, and then we can turn around and propose something that is a good fit for us, and then with this in mind, we can, as we grow, we can make changes to it, right?
Exactly.
So what this all leads up to, as part of the release process, is a point where you say, okay, we've gone through, we've analyzed all the requirements, we've prioritized them, we've looked at our capacity, we've got an agreement from development teams to work on these. TSC, here's our recommended set of requirements for this release. So there's some kind of a presentation. Within ONAP, this becomes a recommendation from the requirements subcommittee to the full TSC. Within just body of the TSC, you have this collection, and at some point you say, okay, I think we've got what we need. Does everyone agree on this? And you vote on that set of requirements for the release. That way, you have everyone on board, you have your team on board with a set of requirements for that specific release. Was there a question? Okay, so I mentioned project release planning, and again, this is with the assumption, and when I refer to projects, sometimes this can get confusing because you have project, we call ODIM a project, but then we also call the sub projects underneath projects as well, and it can get a little confusing. But when I say project release planning here, what I really mean is sub project release planning. So this is important to have your individual sub-projects submit a project release plan, because it creates transparency for the rest of the project of what exactly they're doing. And I'll give you an example. OPNFV had a requirement for a project release plan, but they didn't specify what exactly had to be in the release plan. And so at one point during a meeting with the TSC, I was talking about the projects that we're going to be releasing with a particular release cycle with the TSC, and the TSC member asked me, well, what specifically are their release artifacts? And I said, well, I don't know. And this person, was shocked. It's like, well, you're the release manager, shouldn't you know that? And I said, yeah, I probably should, but the TSC has not agreed to have a template-based project release plan. So there's no requirement for the projects to specify what exactly their release artifacts are. So the best I can do is guess based on what they've released in the past, what their release artifacts are specifically. So that's a kind of, it seems very basic, but if you don't require a project release plan, then it's kind of it can be kind of a mystery of what individual projects are working on. Now, again, going back to comment about the difference between small and large projects, is probably more of an issue with a larger project. But the other thing that it does too is it forces the individual sub-projects to think about all aspects of the release. Have you thought about what you're going to produce as a release artifact? Have you thought about your documentation? Have you thought about testing? How are you going to verify your work, and so on? So you include all of those things within the release plan, and it forces those projects to think about those things. And I've noticed that that's particularly effective with because frequently what we have will have young engineers that get designated as the project technical lead. And it's a great opportunity for them to get some leadership experience, in a technical environment. But the other thing is that because they're young and relatively inexperienced, they haven't thought about, they're just ready to sit down and start writing code, and they haven't thought about all the things that they need to do in terms of having a comprehensive release. And so getting your project teams and your PTLs to think about all aspects of a release, what they're doing with their project, is really helpful in making sure that they truly understand what they need to get done. The other thing that it helps with is often we want to do promotion of the release. And so, the marketing team will come around and say, okay, well, we want to start planning our promotion of your release. What have you done? And you don't want to stand there going, oh, gee, I don't know stuff. We wrote code, So by pointing to, collection of release plans, that's one piece of collateral that you can point the marketing team to get information that they can use to promote the release. Okay, so all of this comes together in terms of a schedule, or we're getting close to our schedule. The next thing that we need to do is determine release milestones. So the release milestones are basically the terminal points for the phases that we talked about earlier. So each one of these phases will have a terminal point, and that terminal point is the milestone. So the milestones, and then of course, when we create a schedule, then we assign those milestones to dates, and then we assign tasks that and evaluation criteria for each of those milestones. So then it's the job of the release manager in conjunction with the technical steering committee to evaluate the criteria for each milestone and then make a determination about whether that criteria has been met. And that's very useful in terms of gauging where you're at. So when you're creating milestones, you want to keep them fairly general. You want to avoid tying them to specific technology or, projects, components. And a good example of that is experience I had with OPNFV. When I joined Linux Foundation 5 years ago, OPNFV had already been around for a couple of years, and they had established their release process, and it was tied to specific, or aspects of it were tied to specific components. Well, with a long-lived project, technology changes, etc. And so your release process ends up growing stale over time because those components are no longer used. And that's what happened to OPNFV. And so we just went through an agonizing process last year and the beginning of this year in overhauling the the release process. We finally got approval from the TSC on a new release process last spring, but it was a very difficult process. So by keeping your milestones fairly general, then you can avoid having your release process become stale. Also, as I mentioned before, each milestone you go through this evaluation process. So, sometimes people can get overeager and say, well, I want to have 27 checkpoints throughout our release process. Well, that just gets to be overwhelming. So you want to be fairly judicious in choosing your milestones, and you only want to choose milestones where you have something that you can verify. So some milestones look good on paper, but then when you actually go to try and measure them, they're unmeasurable, or it's so difficult to get the data, that it overwhelms your team. So make sure that you are picking milestones that can be measured, where the criteria for that milestone can be measured. Okay. Yeah, we talked about measurable criteria. Also, I like to, so a good thing to do to make sure that your sub-projects are staying on track is you assign tasks to them for each milestone. So you need to do this, 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 and this. And using JIRA to document that, that's helpful, both to the TSC and the release manager, as well as to the individual project teams, because the project teams, that list of JIRA tickets that they have for a specific milestone, it's a shopping list of what exactly they need to get done. And so the overhead in terms of, responding to questions and chasing PTLs down to, find out the status and so on, that's reduced considerably by using JIRA and assigning release management tickets for each milestone to your project teams. And so that makes it easy for the release manager and the TSC. You go into JIRA, you look at the status of across all your sub-projects for the whether they've completed their release management tasks or not for that milestone. And then the TSC can understand where they stand in terms of completing the work for that milestone. And then also finally, just like the requirements, the TSC should approve the status at each milestone. In other words, before you move on, say, okay, now we're going on to milestone, whatever, the TSC approves and agrees that you've met the criteria. Now, sometimes that might mean that you have to adjust the schedule. So you might have to push the milestone out because you haven't met all the criteria, or you might decide to grant exceptions, or you might say, okay, well, team XYZ didn't complete such and such task. We're going to defer that task for them to the next milestone. But you want to have all those conversations and have the TSC on board with that before you move forward. All right, we're getting short on time, but what I wanted to do, we've been kind of talking about this in the abstract, and so I wanted to give you a specific example to look at. And so this is the Guilin release for ONAP, which is going on right now. And so you can see, so all the milestones for the release are right here. And you can see, ONAP is a big project, but you can see that there's what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 milestones for the project. And you can see that we have use case and requirements prioritization up here, which ends at M1. That's our planning milestone. That's also in the project plans, have to be submitted. These used to be separate. Now they're combined into one. This is an API phrase. This is basically so between M1 and M2, M3, that's basically your development. Here is your test phase. And then after this is basically the rest of this is preparing for integration and doing integration test. And then finally we get down to sign off. Typically these are separated, but through various circumstances, the TSC for ONAP decided to merge these two milestones for this particular release. And you can see I have a change log down here where I track changes to the schedule over the period of the release. And that's useful for doing a retrospective post-release. Okay, so looking at project status, so here, this is a summary of milestone status. So you can see each of the milestones are listed across the top here. The individual sub-projects are listed on the left. And so you can see the decision of the TSC at each milestone. So all these projects in green with go, of course, moved forward. These ones that you see no go, they either were not participating or dropped out before M1. Looking specifically at milestone status. So these are embedded charts from JIRA. So we can go all the way back to M1. And you can see here's the list of participating sub-projects and the issues. You can see that they were all closed. And this is what the TSC looks at from week to week, or one of the things that they look at. If we go in and look at a individual set of requirements for a milestone for one sub-project, so these are all the requirements for M1. So there's a maturity chart that we track, FOSS, CII. This table tracks the documents that are being used by the sub-project for the release. And so we know we can look to see whether any new projects or new documents are being added. Signing issues. You know, there's a lot of people that don't understand good JIRA issue management hygiene, and so have you know, developers that don't recognize that they need to document their features and bugs and so on. So we have an explicit issue that says make sure that you have selected you've documented all your issues and they're assigned to the Guilin release. We have code coverage. ONAP uses Sonar, and we set code coverage goals. For this release, we did a project lifecycle review. We advanced a number of projects to the mature state. We need to make sure that projects are communicating with each other in terms of API changes. Here's the release planning template that I was talking about. So you can see that Dan submitted his release planning document, and this is for the sub-project. So all the things that we talked about in terms of documenting features and deliverables. Here's an overview of what the architecture looks like for that sub-project, risks, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of data in here. In this, we were talked about the architectural subcommittee. So one of the requirements that ONAP has is that each project get reviewed by the architectural subcommittee, so that the architectural subcommittee can understand the overall impact of what projects are doing, on ONAP as a whole. So, so that's my presentation. I hope that you found that useful. There's a lot of details that you can go into here, as you can see. I tried to keep it kind of at a high level, without getting, down into the weeds too far. But hopefully you found this useful.
Yeah, it's very useful. And again, if you could post those slides somewhere, if you don't have the permission, Luis can probably put them up there. I guess one good place would be for today's TSC call. We only have 3 minutes left, and actually this presentation and the fact that we have been looking at one proposal for composition service for a couple of weeks without actually reaching a conclusion sort of suggests that perhaps we need a separate working group or separate meeting time to just look at these proposals, what David here referred to as requirements. So I don't know if that's something we should set up. Any thoughts from anybody? I mean, we can take that.
Jonas,
go ahead.
Hello everyone. This is Muthu from EMI. I agree with Jonas. If we can set up a separate call to discuss on that, it will be really good. But it's based on the time and availability of other.
Yeah, I'll just keep the same time on a different day. Sorry, Alex, go ahead.
I don't disagree with you, Jonas. I think we need to set up a separate time. I would distinguish between collecting requirements for a given thing versus actually looking at the architectural sort of or design approaches. And those to me are two separate kind of functions. And I think most of our discussion has really focused not really on the need to have something like this, but more on how would we get it done, right?
Yeah.
And the architectural impact of getting it done in a particular way. So I agree we should have a separate ARC meeting.
And we can have it every week, and then if there are no proposals or requirements, we can cancel the call.
Exactly.
Right?
Yes. Well, the other thing we can do in that meeting is actually think about sort of the eventual desired state from. We've kind of been sort of dancing around the fact of, around the discussion of how monolithic or how loosely coupled or how integrated all these different ODIM services should be. To me, that's a good thing to discuss in the ARC as well.
Yep.
And then drive projects towards that end state, maybe not in one hop, but in multiple hops for sure.
Yep. We just 1 minute left, so I can set up that call. I can see if I can send out an invite. I think I'll look for a day, and then we over the TSC mailing list we can decide if it's a good day or not. Another thing that we had last week that was important was for Luis to go and figure out if we could move to something like LFN. Because we might need some of the services like Jira and these things, and still participate. People that are not members of LFN could still participate in the project. And I just got from Luis here in a private chat that is the case. Anyone can participate in the ODIM project, even if you're under LFN. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's the case. Now, some folks may have to see if there's they may have some internal policies. But as far as participating in this open source project, it's available for anybody to participate.
Yeah, so we need to go back to our individual companies and discuss. But I think within the next couple of weeks, this is something that we should discuss in TSC for sure.
Agreed. And then we can start setting up a proposal to put in front of the LFN TAC committee. And then we can see about, getting us under the LFN umbrella. That's the way.
So I'm just bringing it up as a topic. There might be a different outcome after discussions, but I think that was a big roadblock that you just removed. So sorry, guys, we're over time.
Thank you, David, for a great. Yeah, I just want to say thanks to David. That was a really helpful presentation. Thank you very much.
Good. I'm glad. And thanks, Louis, for inviting me. And if you'd like to talk about, specific issues in the future, I'm happy to come back.
Appreciate that.
Great.
Yeah.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you,
Bye.
everybody. Have a wonderful day.